Welcome to episode 11 of the AlphaTutorials podcast, and welcome to 2012 in our new studios and a new opportunity to be able to share with you in some of the great adventures that come along in the Sony Alpha range. We're going to kick off today's show with the news items. There's been a little bit of news that's happened in the break that we had during the festive season. One of those news items was an announcement from Sony of a new firmware update. We knew it was going to come. We just were getting a little bit anxious that it was taking its time, and that's the firmware update for the NEX5, NEX3, and the NEXC3 to be compatible with the LAEA2. Got to remember those codes. LAEA2 adapter. Now that adapter allows you to put the alpha lenses onto the NEX system, but unlike the original EA1 adapter, the EA2 has a translucent mirror inside of it. And that translucent mirror means that you're basically turning your camera into an Alpha 55 or something along those lines. Now that NEX will also then benefit from phase detect autofocus, which is a lot faster and a lot more accurate. And the EA2 adapter also allows compatibility with the older lenses that don't have their internal focusing motor. So you're talking about, for example, old Minolta lenses that would be able to work on that adapter and autofocus. It's quite exciting. You'll find the link in our show notes on alphatutorials.co.za, where you'll be able to go and download the podcast, as well as download the firmware update from Sony's website and read the blog post from Sony about what the other updates are from the firmware. Other news that happened while we were away was I read on Petapixel, which is a great photography website, of a photographer with an Alpha 55 that damaged his mirror, his translucent mirror, while using cleaning fluid on it. Never, ever, ever, ever use cleaning fluid inside your camera. And on your focusing screen or on your mirror, just try and avoid touching it altogether. Well, in any case, this person did something which we're not going to completely endorse, but it may save you in an absolute emergency. And that is they used cling wrap or plastic wrap as a replacement for the translucent mirror. You can head over to the show notes where you'll find a link to that article and see how he did it. Again, we're not highly recommending it, but you never know. You may be in a situation where you just need to come up with a quick fix in a hurry. But please don't let it be because you cleaned your focusing screen or your mirror using cleaning fluids. The last thing we wanted to just talk about is this week, as we're busy shooting this podcast, is the beginning of the CES and PMA conferences in Las Vegas. Kicking off the show a bit early was Sony's announcement of their new XQD memory cards. Now, this is a new memory card format. It's not solely Sony's. There are other manufacturers on board with it as well. But the big deal about this memory format is it means that manufacturers can put more storage capacity and higher speed storage, read-write speeds, than any current format can possibly support. In fact, the new Sony cards that have just been announced offer 1 gigabit per second download speeds or write speeds to the memory card, which is an incredible improvement over the 150 megabyte that you can get off of a compact flash card, for example. That's it for the news. Instead of a full-on tutorial today, I wanted to kind of just wrap up what we've discussed over the last couple of shows and just give you a breakdown of where you can head to be able to see some of those podcast ideas, those tutorial ideas, and be able to improve, go back, refresh yourself as we move forward. We're going to be looking at more camera-specific tutorials. The tutorials that we've covered up to so far have been very general and the essentials of photography, pretty much. If you go and you look at episode 1 and episode 3 of our podcasts, you'll find the basics of exposure, ISO, aperture, and shutter speeds. We spoke about how all of those three relate to each other and how you need to balance them to get correct exposure. We also spoke about how aperture affects depth of field and shutter speeds affects whether you're going to have the ability to freeze your subject or not. So head over to episodes 1 and 3 if you want more information on that. Episode 4, we spoke about the different exposure modes: program, aperture priority, shutter priority, manual, and the various different scene modes. Remember what we said, program mode allows you to override certain things that the scene modes don't allow you to do. For example, you'll be able to take control of your ISO while not having to worry about setting your aperture or shutter speed. It also allows you to use the exposure compensation feature to make your image lighter or darker. The scene modes don't give you that functionality, so try and avoid staying away from those scene modes. Don't go into them. Rather stick to program, and then as your confidence improves, look at aperture, shutter priority, and manual. But head over to episode 4 to be able to see what we discussed there. Episode 7, you'll find us talking about the light meter and the way it measures light as 18% gray. You'll also learn about the metering modes in episode 8. Episode 9 speaks about the focusing modes. Now, episode 8 and 9 we're going to come back to in a moment, because we got a question just now from a viewer that we want to just address, which relates to those 2 episodes. And then lastly, our very last episode before we shut down in 2011 was the white balance episode, where we looked at how white balance controls the different color of light and how you can even use that creatively. Now, Invisible Cut sent us an email that he had questions about the way that exposure lock and focus lock were working when you half press down your shutter on your camera. Now, he pointed out something that I had not been aware of before on the Sony cameras, and that is when you have your camera set to center weighted or spot metering mode, and you hold down the shutter halfway, it locks the focus, but it doesn't lock the exposure, which it does do in evaluative mode. It seems a bit odd because I don't recall other cameras doing that, but I checked it myself today on our A35 here, and it does definitely do that. There's a workaround to be able to overcome that problem, because you don't want to be measuring your exposure and locking your focus and the exposure changes when you recompose. So what you can do is either lock the exposure itself using the exposure lock button on the back, or if you're not wanting to lock the exposure but you're wanting to lock the focus, you can also use the button here at the bottom, which you can customize in your menu for depth of field preview or for focus locking. So that might help you, Invisible Cut, in being able to try and resolve the problem and concern that you had around that. We appreciate your feedback. Please head over to alphatutorials.co.za and send us your feedback, send us your questions. And we're happy to answer questions, and that there's some great articles and news stuff happening on the website as well. And there'll be a lot more activity there in 2012. See you next time. Cheers.